Rawls's definition of civil disobedience is based off the work of Badeau, as he defines civil disobedience as, quote, a public, nonviolent, conscientious yet political act contrary to law, usually done with the aim of bringing about a change in the law or policies of the government. As he states at the beginning of his definition and justification of civil disobedience, he makes the assumption that the state of near justice can only be achieved through a legitimate democracy, and states that his theory does not apply to other sorts of governments. Rawls frames civil disobedience as something that, when acted, appeals to the community's majority sense of justice. One is not required to break the same law that they are protesting and must do what is appropriate. He uses an example of how one should not protest a vague law about treason by committing the treasonous act, since the punishment would be so harsh as to not justify such a sacrifice. When being civilly disobedient, one must operate with a sense of justice and uphold the Constitution. One does not interfere with the civil liberties of others, and it is in accepting responsibility for one's actions, which have been done publicly and in a nonviolent manner, that one is able to appeal to the majority. When Rawls explains the justification of civil disobedience, he first outlines what kind of wrongs one would be justified in being civilly disobedient to. He says, quote, if one views such disobedience as a political act addressed to the sense of justice of the community, then it seems reasonable to limit it to instances of substantial and clear injustice. This is an important limitation set by Rawls because it highlights his belief that there is a sense of justice which is held by the majority, a sense of justice which dictates what is acceptable or unacceptable. Peter Singer will later critique this view. Rawls's first condition for civil disobedience is that serious violations of the principles of equal liberty and fair and equal opportunity warrant civil disobedience. The discussion then moves on to whether or not basic liberties are satisfied, which can lead to difficult distinctions having to be made. In order to address these difficulties, Rawls says that one must be conscientious of our self-interest and prejudices. The second condition for civil disobedience set by Rawls is that an appeal to the law or political majority must have already been made, and the consequences of such action did not result in termination of the unjust policy. Rawls's third condition is one of restraint. He gives the example of many minority groups banding together to protest an injustice which affects them, and one in which they are justified in protesting. In such an unlikely scenario, a breakdown of law and order could occur, so there should be a certain amount of restraint in such a situation. If one looks at the role of the law in Plato's Credo, one finds that for Socrates one must always adhere to the law, because to not to do so would be to undo everything that the government stands for. Socrates would not enact civil disobedience because he does not believe in the idea of unjust laws. However, one could suppose that the condition of restraint would be favored in the view of Socrates, since for him fidelity to the law is extremely important. Rawls says that favored members of society have an obligation to uphold the Constitution more than members of subjected minorities, since they are in better position and have more opportunities. In a near-just society, Rawls assumes that principles of justice are widely known. Civil disobedience is used while maintaining principles of justice to correct departures from it. He mentions two problems. The first is setting up guidelines for one's natural duties and obligations, yet maintaining the Constitution and adhering to majority rule. The second regards situations in which there is only partial adherence to just principles. Ultimately, for Rawls, civil disobedience relies on common conception of justice, which is a political principle. Religious convictions may motivate one to be civilly disobedient, yet according to Rawls, it is through a sense of justice outside of religion that one is justified. So even though Martin Luther King Jr. was heavily influenced by religious doctrine, he was appealing to the political sense of justice and issues regarding equality under the law, instead of in the eyes of God, when he advocated civil disobedience. Singer disagrees with this view and argues that we should be able to appeal to our own personal, moral, or religious beliefs when being civilly disobedient. For Singer, the purpose of civil disobedience is to make a plea to the majority and see if the beliefs of the majority are swayed by the act. Singer says that the conception of justice outlined by Rawls is either too wide or too narrow in scope. Singer also has a problem with determining when a law is just or not, which never gets clearly resolved by Rawls. Rawls addresses skeptics of his idea that the community operates with a sense of justice by saying that though some operate under their own self-interests, the question is whether their tendencies are so widespread as to oppose the sense of justice, which he finds unlikely in a nearly just society. Ultimately, for Rawls, civil disobedience serves to maintain the agreed-upon sense of justice outlined in a near-just democratic society and prevent unjust institutions from manifesting themselves within it.